It began, not with a single moment, but with a slow, unfolding tide, centuries in the making. Long before the crack of muskets at Lexington, before the fiery debates in Philadelphia, and before 13 colonies imagined themselves a nation there, was only wilderness and a dream. In the year 1607, the first permanent English settlement in North America took root. Jamestown, Virginia, a fragile outpost on the banks of the James River, established by the Virginia Company, under charter from King James I of England. Life there was harsh, uncertain. Yet it marked the quiet beginning of a vast colonial enterprise. Over the next century and a half, English settlers would spread along the eastern seaboard, founding colonies from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south. Each colony carried with it a piece of England, its language, its laws, its customs. But over time, something new began to form. Though English by origin, the colonists became, increasingly, American by experience. They built towns, established governments, tilled the land, and formed communities that, while loyal to the crown, were slowly diverging from the mother country. Throughout the 1600s and into the early 1700s, the British Crown followed a policy known as salutary neglect, a deliberate distance in governance that allowed the colonies a high degree of autonomy, particularly in local affairs and trade. This freedom suited the colonists. Provincial assemblies gained power, local economies flourished, and the sense of independence, quiet but growing, took root. Still, the connection to Britain remained strong. The colonists saw themselves as loyal subjects of the king, protected by the British military, and part of a larger imperial system that spanned the globe. That balance of freedom and loyalty would hold for a time. But across the Atlantic, winds of change were stirring, and they would soon sweep across the colonies like a storm. By the early 18th century, Britain's empire was expanding rapidly. Trade flowed through its ports, goods from India, the West Indies, and North America filled its markets. The colonies too were thriving, exporting tobacco, rice, timber, and fish while importing finished goods from Britain in return. But as the colonial population grew, reaching over 1 million by mid-century, so too did tensions over land, governance, and imperial control. The frontier pushed westward, drawing settlers closer to territories claimed by France and to lands inhabited by powerful Native American nations. The struggle for empire in North America came to a head in the mid-1700s with a conflict that would forever alter the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. In 1754, war erupted between Britain and France over territorial disputes in the Ohio River Valley, a fertile region both powers sought to control. This conflict, known in America as the French and Indian War, and in Europe as part of the larger 7 Years' War, would last nearly a decade and engulf much of the known world. British colonists fought alongside regular troops and militias, were raised from Virginia to New York. Among those who gained early experience in this war was a young Virginia officer named George Washington, whose name, though little known then, would echo through history. The war was brutal, fought in dense forests, along rivers, and on the edges of settlement. But in the end, Britain emerged victorious. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, bringing an end to hostilities. France ceded vast territories, Canada, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, to British control. It was a moment of triumph, yet it came at great cost. Britain's war debt had nearly doubled. The defense and administration of new lands would require more troops, more bureaucracy, and, inevitably, more revenue. For Parliament and the Crown, the colonies, now safer and more prosperous than ever, seemed the logical place to begin raising funds. For the colonists, however, that assumption would become the first crack in an imperial bond. Following the Treaty of Paris, in 1763, British officials turned their attention to the administration of their newly expanded empire. The question now was not simply how to celebrate victory, but how to govern and pay for it. In October of that year, the Crown issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, a document that, at first glance, seemed minor, but would carry profound consequences. The proclamation drew a boundary line, known as the Proclamation Line, along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding colonists from settling west of it. The purpose was to avoid conflict with native tribes who had not been consulted in the Treaty of Paris, and to stabilize the western frontier. But for settlers, eager to move westward, including veterans who had been promised land, as a reward for service, the restriction was deeply frustrating. Many ignored it, settling illegally beyond the line and sowing further discord between colonial ambitions and imperial control. At the same time, Britain began enacting new economic policies to recoup the massive debt incurred during the war. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, a revenue-raising measure that taxed imports of sugar, molasses, and other goods, though similar laws had existed before. This one came with strict enforcement and expanded powers for customs officials. The Currency Act, also passed in 1764, restricted colonial governments from issuing their own paper money, a move that, though intended to stabilize trade, further strained local economies. These laws marked a shift in British colonial policy. Where once there had been a light touch, now there was oversight, taxation, and enforcement. For many colonists, it felt less like governance and more like intrusion. But perhaps most significant was the change in perception. Colonists, who had long considered themselves loyal Englishmen, began to sense that they were being treated not as equal partners in empire, but as subjects to be managed and taxed at will. In private letters, in tavern conversations, in local assemblies, questions were quietly raised. What right had Parliament to tax colonists who had no representation in its chambers? Was this merely the cost of empire, or something more troubling? The seeds of discontent were small, but they had been sown. The aftermath of the French and Indian War marked a turning point, not just in imperial geography, but in imperial philosophy. For over a century, Britain had governed its colonies with a light hand. The war changed that calculus. The Crown now saw its American holdings not simply as distant partners, but as integral parts of a growing global empire, subject to tighter control and contribution. The colonists, by contrast, had developed a political culture rooted in local governance, personal liberty, and self-determination. Their experience in the war, raising militias, defending territory, managing trade, had only deepened their sense of capability and autonomy. It was, at its core, a collision of WORLDVIEWS. Two British officials, taxation and enforcement, were practical measures. To the colonists, they were an affront, a step backward from the freedoms they had come to expect. The events of 1763 may not have inspired immediate rebellion, but they marked the beginning of a subtle unraveling, the slow erosion of trust between colony and crown. In the coming years, these tensions would only grow. The proclamation of 1763, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, each was a pebble tossed into the waters of colonial life. And though the ripples were small at first, they began to widen. By the mid-1760s, colonial resistance had become more organized. Pamphlets were printed, town meetings grew more vocal, and assemblies began challenging imperial edicts with increasing confidence. British attempts to assert control were met not with gratitude, but with suspicion. The colonial identity, once proudly English, was beginning to shift. Not toward full independence, not yet, but toward something new, something uncertain. A gap had opened between how the British viewed their empire and how the colonists saw themselves within it. That gap would grow, and soon, it would become a chasm. As the 1760s unfolded, the delicate balance between Britain and her American colonies teetered. New laws would follow, each stirring fresh waves of resistance. From Boston to Charleston, a spirit of defiance began to stir, quiet at first, but growing louder with every act, every tax, every decree from Parliament. And while no one could yet foresee the coming storm, the skies were darkening. In the next chapter, we turn to the rising tensions of the 1760s and early 1770s, from the Stamp Act to the Boston Massacre, and the slow, deliberate march toward revolution. The war had ended, but peace would prove elusive. In 1763, as British troops packed up their tents and diplomats signed away empires in ink, the American colonies stood at a crossroads. The French threat was gone, their borders had expanded, and the land, it seemed, stretched endlessly westward. But with the empire's victory came new burdens. And with those burdens came new expectations. The British Crown, seeing its North American colonies now safe and prosperous, believed they should begin to shoulder more of the imperial load, in taxes, in obedience, in loyalty. Yet the colonists, having fought, sacrificed, and expanded under their own resolve, felt they had earned greater freedom, not less. This growing disconnect, quiet at first, but persistent, would deepen. With each passing year, it began with a line on a map and ended in blood on cobblestone streets. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, was designed as a practical solution to post-war management. It declared that colonists were forbidden to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, a gesture meant to appease native nations and prevent costly frontier wars. But to thousands of settlers and land speculators, it felt like betrayal. Many had already purchased or claimed lands beyond the mountains. Veterans, promised western lands in return for their service, were now told they could not settle them. The proclamation became a symbol not just of royal authority, but of imperial indifference to colonial interests. And then, in 1765, came the Stamp Act. Parliament, facing a staggering national debt and mounting expenses for imperial defense, passed a law requiring that most printed materials in the colonies, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, bear an official stamp, purchased with British currency. It was the first direct tax imposed by Parliament on the colonies, and it ignited a firestorm. Unlike customs duties or trade regulations, the Stamp Act affected nearly every colonist, from merchants and lawyers to printers and farmers. It struck at the heart of daily life and, more importantly, at the core of colonial identity. For the colonists, the issue was not just the money, it was the principle. They had no elected representatives in Parliament, and yet they were being taxed. Out of this tension arose a phrase that would echo through history: no taxation without representation. Across the colonies, protest erupted. In Boston, merchants refused to sell stamped paper. In Virginia, Patrick Henry stood in the House of Burgesses, declaring that only colonial assemblies had the right to tax their citizens. And in New York, representatives from 9 colonies gathered in what became known as the Stamp Act Congress, one of the first unified colonial responses to British policy. But resistance was not limited to words. In cities from Massachusetts to South Carolina, groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty emerged. Sometimes orderly, sometimes unruly, these men organized protests, intimidated stamp distributors, and sometimes destroyed tax offices entirely. The message was clear. This law would not be obeyed. Faced with boycotts of British goods, unrest in the colonies, and resistance from English merchants fearful of losing trade, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Celebrations broke out in the colonies. Bells rang, toasts were raised, and many believed that reason had prevailed. But even in repeal, Parliament issued a warning. Alongside the repeal came the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament's authority to make laws in all cases whatsoever for the colonies. It was a line drawn in the sand, and the tide of imperial policy would soon shift again. In 1767, the Townshend Acts introduced new duties on imported goods, including glass, paper, paint, and tea. This time, the revenue would fund royal governors and officials in the colonies, weakening the power of colonial assemblies. Again, resistance grew. Boycotts resumed. Colonial women, often overlooked in political histories, played a vital role, weaving homespun cloth and organizing non-importation efforts to reduce dependence on British goods. In 1768, British troops arrived in Boston to enforce order. Red-coated soldiers marched through cobbled streets, their presence a daily reminder of growing imperial control. Tensions rose. And then, on a cold March night in 1770, violence erupted. A crowd gathered near the Custom House in Boston, hurling snowballs, insults, and debris at a group of British soldiers. The situation spiraled out of control. Amidst the confusion, shots rang out. 5 colonists were killed. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, who would be remembered as the first casualty in the American struggle for liberty. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Though only minutes long, It would be immortalized in pamphlets, engravings, and fiery speeches. Paul Revere's iconic, though exaggerated, depictions spread throughout the colonies, fueling anger and sympathy. In the aftermath, the British soldiers involved were arrested and tried. Defended, notably, by John Adams, a future president, most were acquitted, and order was briefly restored. Parliament, seeking to ease tensions, repealed most of the townshend duties except one, the tax on tea. This symbolic act would soon spark one of the most famous protests in colonial history. In December 1773, the British East India Company was granted a monopoly on tea sales in America, along with a tax that colonists viewed as illegitimate. In Boston, a group of men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded 3 ships in the harbor and dumped over 300 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, shocked British officials, and this time they would not back down. The period from 1763 to 1774 was defined, not by open war, but by a series of actions and reactions, a gradual escalation that tested the boundaries of imperial authority and colonial resistance. At the heart of it all was a question of identity. Were the colonists simply British subjects overseas, bound by the same laws and expectations as those in London or Manchester? Or were they something different, something new? For Parliament, the answer was clear. The colonies were part of the empire, and subject to its laws. But for the colonists, increasingly confident in their institutions, proud of their sacrifices, in war, and accustomed to self-rule, that answer no longer satisfied. The arrival of troops, the imposition of taxes, the dismissal of local concerns. Each act chipped away at the bond that had once united colony and crown. The Boston Massacre and Tea Party were not isolated events. They were symptoms of a deeper unrest. And with every protest, boycott, and pamphlet, the idea of independence, once unthinkable, grew a little more possible. Britain's response to the Boston Tea Party was swift and severe. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of punitive laws known in Britain as the Coercive Acts, but in the colonies, they were called something else, the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed, its economy strangled. The Massachusetts Charter was altered, placing greater power in royal hands. Town meetings were restricted, and British officials accused of crimes could now be tried in England, not in colonial courts. To many, this was not just punishment for Boston, but a warning to all. And yet, rather than divide the colonies, the Intolerable Acts united them. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia, forming the First Continental Congress. It was not yet a call to arms, but it was a call to unity, to coordinated resistance, and to the assertion of rights long denied. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights, organized boycotts, and laid the groundwork for what was to come. The colonies were no longer scattered provinces, responding in isolation. They were becoming something more. A movement had begun. The road to revolution did not begin with muskets or declarations, but with laws, protests, and a slow erosion of trust. From the proclamation of 1763 to the closing of Boston Harbor in 1774, the seeds of rebellion had been planted, and they were beginning to take root. In the next segment, we turn to the growing urgency of 1775 as militias muster, tempers flare, and the world watches the dawn of a new chapter. Soon, the first shots will be fired, and history will never be the same. By the summer of 1774, the air in the American colonies was thick with uncertainty. The port of Boston, once vibrant with ships and trade, now sat quiet, blockaded by the Royal Navy. British soldiers marched through its streets, their bayonets catching the morning light. Town meetings had been silenced, and the laws, once written in colonial assemblies, were now issued from across the ocean. To the British Parliament, these were acts of discipline. To the colonists, they felt like punishment, but something was changing. Where once the colonies had responded to imperial policies alone, now they turned toward one another. And from 13 separate voices, a single, cautious chorus began to form. It was in this moment of crisis that the idea of a Continental Congress was born. The decision to convene a Congress was not made lightly. Throughout the spring and summer of 1774, In towns and cities across the colonies, committees of correspondence exchanged letters, sharing news of Boston's plight and calling for a united response. The outrage over the intolerable acts had struck a chord not just in Massachusetts, but in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and beyond. It was no longer just Boston's fight. It was a question of principle of liberty and of how far British authority might reach. In June, the Virginia House of Burgesses, dissolved by its royal governor, reconvened unofficially in a tavern, where they proposed a general congress of all the colonies. One by one, provincial assemblies selected delegates. Some were lawyers, others planters or merchants, many had served in local governments. All were deeply aware that their decisions could shape the future of the continent. And so, on a warm September day in the city of Philadelphia, the delegates arrived. They came by horseback and carriage from as far north as New Hampshire, and as far south as South Carolina. They gathered, not in rebellion, but in resolution, to seek redress, to preserve peace, and to speak. At last, with one voice, the First Continental Congress opened on September 5, 1774. At Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, 56 delegates attended representing 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia, still dependent on British military protection against native raids, abstained, though it followed the proceedings closely. Among the delegates were many names that would later become etched in the story of the Revolution. George Washington, the tall, quiet Virginian who would one day lead armies. John Adams of Massachusetts, eloquent, principled, and sharp-witted. Samuel Adams, his cousin. The veteran organizer of protest, Patrick Henry, famed for his thunderous oratory. John J. Age, the reserved legal mind from New York, and Peyton Randolph, who would be elected to serve as president of the Congress. Despite their differences in background, economy, and political culture, the delegates shared a common goal: to assert the rights of the colonies within the empire without yet severing ties. The proceedings were conducted behind closed doors, in part to allow frank discussion, and, in part, to protect the delegates from accusations of sedition. Though deeply respectful of British law and tradition, the Congress firmly believed that the colonies were entitled to the rights of Englishmen, including representation in any body that levied taxes upon them. They did not yet speak of independence, but they did speak of unity, and in that, the Congress took its first great step. Deliberations began slowly. There was no official blueprint for what a Continental Congress should be, no precedent for unified governance among the colonies. Some delegates favored a moderate tone, fearing that strong demands might provoke war. Others believed the time had come for firmer resistance. John Adams would later recall the mood in his diary, describing the delegates as respectful but wary strangers met for the first time, with various prejudices, distant interests, and mutual suspicions. Yet, over the course of several weeks, common ground was found. The Congress drafted and adopted a document known as the Declaration and Resolves, issued on October 14, 1774. It outlined a clear colonial position that the colonies were entitled to life, liberty, and property, that they had never ceded the right to be taxed only by their own legislatures, that the intolerable acts were unjust and should be repealed. At the heart of the document was a plea, not for rebellion, but for reconciliation. It called for the restoration of colonial rights, while expressing continued loyalty to King George III. In tandem with the declaration, the Congress organized a non-importation agreement, a widespread boycott of British goods, to pressure Parliament economically. It also established the Continental Association, a formal network of committees to enforce the boycott in towns and counties throughout the colonies. These committees would grow in influence, becoming, in many places, the de facto local governments. As royal authority declined, perhaps most importantly, the Congress agreed to reconvene in May 1775. Should their grievances remain unanswered, it was a significant shift. The colonies were not merely reacting to imperial policy, they were preparing for the long term, and though their tone was respectful, their actions were deliberate. The First Continental Congress closed in late October 1774. The delegates returned home, some to applause, others to uncertainty. They did not know what Parliament would do next, but they knew this: The colonies were no longer isolated voices. They had spoken, and they had spoken together. The First Continental Congress marked a subtle but critical transformation in colonial identity. Whereas past protests had been local and reactive, this was coordinated and preemptive. Where once the colonies had appealed as subjects, now they began to act as partners. It is important to remember that few, if any, delegates spoke openly of revolution. Most believed that reconciliation was still possible and even preferable, but what they had created, intentionally or not, was the framework of a continental resistance. A shared cause, a political infrastructure, and a sense that the colonies, despite their differences, could act with unity and purpose. The Continental Association, in particular, became a proving ground for cooperation, a dress rehearsal for collective governance. And in agreeing to meet again, the Congress acknowledged a truth that could not be undone, that the relationship between Britain and her colonies had changed, and would not return to what it once was. News of the Congresses. Actions spread quickly, in broadsheets, sermons, and town meetings. In Britain, the response was one of indignation and disbelief. Parliament viewed the Congress as illegal, its resolutions as defiant. Rather than soften its stance, the British government doubled down, preparing new laws and considering the use of military force to restore order. In the colonies, however, something deeper had shifted. Committees of safety sprang up to enforce the boycott and prepare local defenses. Militias began drilling more regularly, stockpiling powder and arms. And beneath the calm surface of rural towns and coastal cities, there was a growing sense of inevitability. The petition had been sent. The words had been spoken. Now the colonies waited for a reply, and what would come next would not be words. As the winter of 1774 gave way to spring, tensions rose like the thawing rivers. In Boston, General Thomas Gage, the British commander, prepared for unrest. In Concord, Massachusetts colonial militias quietly gathered supplies. And across the 13 colonies, farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants alike stood ready, uncertain of what tomorrow might bring. The First Continental Congress had lit the lantern of unity, but in the months to come, it would be musket fire that lit the path ahead. In the next segment, we turn to April 1775, to Lexington, to Concord, and to the day when the Revolution would truly begin. April dawned softly over New England, the trees still bare the earth, just beginning to thaw after the long winter. In the quiet towns outside Boston, daily life continued. Farmers tending fields, blacksmiths at their forges, and children playing beneath gray spring skies, but beneath the calm there was tension. For months, rumors had swirled. British troops, watching, marching, planning. Colonial militias drilling in the shadows of barns and meeting houses, and all across Massachusetts. Whispers of something imminent, then. In the early hours of April 19, 1775, history arrived on horseback. And with it, the first sparks of war. Following the First Continental Congress, the British government had grown increasingly wary of colonial unrest, particularly in Massachusetts, where protest had taken on a tone of defiance. General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in North America and military governor of Massachusetts, had received orders from London, suppress the rebellion before it spread. Intelligence reached Gage that colonial militias were stockpiling arms and gunpowder in the town of Concord, just 20 miles northwest of Boston. He devised a plan, a secret night march to Concord to seize the weapons and arrest rebel leaders, including Samuel Adams and John Hancock, believed to be in nearby Lexington, but the secrecy would not hold. Patriot intelligence networks, including the Sons of Liberty and Committee of Safety, had been watching closely. And on the night of April 18th, 2 riders were dispatched to warn the countryside, Paul Revere and William Dawes. They galloped through the darkness, lanterns high, calling out the message that would echo through history: the British are coming. The countryside responded with speed and resolve. The Minutemen, colonial militias trained to be ready at a moment's notice, mobilized throughout Middlesex County. In Lexington, a small village along the road to Concord, Captain John Parker gathered his men on the town green. They were farmers and craftsmen, fathers and sons, armed with muskets and resolve. but uncertain of what was to come. As dawn broke on April 19th, a column of nearly 700 British regulars, led by Major John Pitcairn and Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, approached Lexington. What happened next has been debated ever since. As the Redcoats marched into view, Parker's militia stood waiting, about 70 strong. The atmosphere was tense, but not yet violent. Parker reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Moments later, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but that single, anonymous shot set off a volley of musket fire, brief, chaotic, and deadly. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. Several others were wounded. The British, largely unharmed, continued their march. The confrontation at Lexington lasted only minutes yet. Its echoes would reach across oceans. It would soon be called the shot heard round the world. The British column pressed on toward Concord, but by now, the alarm had spread like wildfire. From barns and fields, from taverns and churches, hundreds of militiamen answered the call. As the Redcoats entered Concord around 9 a.m., colonial forces were already gathering at Northbridge, just outside the town. About 400 Minutemen faced off against a smaller British detachment guarding the area. Unlike at Lexington, the colonists were now on the offensive. Orders were exchanged, nerves strained, and once again, shots rang out. This time, the British suffered casualties and began to fall back. It was the first time American colonists had fired in formation upon British troops and driven them back. The withdrawal quickly turned into a desperate retreat. As the British retraced their route back to Boston, colonial militias harassed them from behind trees, stone walls, and forests. Gunfire rang out from hidden positions, supplies ran low, and wounded soldiers fell along the road. By the end of the day, nearly 1,700 colonial militia had joined the fight. The British suffered 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. Colonial casualties numbered 49 dead and 41 wounded. For many, the meaning of the day was clear. The revolution had begun. What had started as a pre-dawn skirmish had transformed into open warfare. The colonies had resisted, not with words, but with arms. The battles of Lexington and Concord were small by the standards of great wars, but symbolically, they were seismic. They marked the first time American colonists had openly resisted British troops in armed conflict, not as scattered rioters, but as organized militia, defending local towns and supplies. And though independence had not yet been declared, the divide between colony and empire had crossed a point of no return. For the British, the events were a disaster. They had intended a swift, quiet suppression of unrest, a show of force to maintain order. Instead, they found a countryside, prepared, motivated, and angry. For the colonists, the day was a rallying cry, proof that the empire could be resisted, and that resistance would be remembered. Within days, militia forces from other colonies began marching toward Massachusetts. Boston was surrounded, and the uneasy peace that had lingered for a decade was over. Lexington and Concord did not decide the war, but they began it in the aftermath. The political landscape shifted rapidly. The British government responded by declaring the colonies in a state of rebellion. Thousands of reinforcements were dispatched across the Atlantic, and preparations for a prolonged conflict began. In the colonies, the response was swift and determined. Committees of safety mobilized men and resources. The Second Continental Congress was summoned, scheduled to meet in May 1775, not as a loose assembly of petitioners but as a wartime council. Armed conflict had now replaced debate. In towns across the colonies, ordinary citizens, many who had never before seen battle, began training for war. Farmers shouldered muskets, printers prepared pamphlets, and blacksmiths forged tools for a revolution they now believed was not only possible but necessary. The events at Lexington and Concord had transformed the question from if there would be war to when it would reach their doorstep. The road ahead would be long, uncertain, and full of sacrifice. But as April 19th faded into memory, a new era had dawned. The age of negotiation had ended. The age of revolution had begun. The shots at Lexington and Concord were more than just gunfire. They were the collapse of an old world and the first breath of a new one. As British troops returned to Boston, bloodied and shaken colonial leaders began to prepare for what lay ahead. In the next segment, we turn to the gathering of the Second Continental Congress, to the selection of a commander-in-chief, to the siege of Boston, and to the early battles that would define the first year of the war. The flames of revolution had been lit, and there would be no turning back. The summer of 1775 unfolded with a slow mounting tension. Boston, once a bustling colonial port, now lay surrounded by thousands of colonial militiamen. British troops, entrenched within the city, eyed the surrounding hills nervously as the American Revolution moved from protest to siege. Just 2 months after the battles at Lexington and Concord, both sides now braced for what was coming next. The war had begun, but the struggle for its first major victory had only just begun. Following the outbreak of violence in April, colonial militias from across New England had gathered swiftly outside Boston. By May, an estimated 20,000 colonial troops had encircled the city in what became known as the Siege of Boston. Inside the city, General Thomas Gage, now reinforced by British troops under Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, faced the challenge of holding the port and restoring imperial control. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress, convened in May 1775, while still cautious about the full break with Britain, delegates took decisive steps. On June 14, they formally established the Continental Army, and on June 15, they unanimously appointed George Washington of Virginia as its commander-in-chief. The choice was symbolic and strategic. Washington's military experience and southern roots helped unify the colonies behind the growing conflict. As June continued, tensions in Boston reached a breaking point. Rebel forces learned that the British intended to seize the high ground around the city, particularly Dorchester Heights and Charlestown Peninsula, including Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. On the night of June 16, 1775, colonial troops moved swiftly to preempt the British. By dawn, they had fortified the top of Breed's Hill. The stage was set for one of the most iconic early battles of the war. The colonial defensive line across the Charlestown Peninsula was rough and hastily built. Led by Colonel William Prescott, approximately 1,200 colonial troops dug trenches and constructed earthen fortifications, with minimal artillery and limited ammunition. Although it is commonly referred to as the Battle of Bunker Hill, the majority of fighting actually took place on Breed's Hill, which lay closer to Boston and offered a more strategic position. British commanders, upon spotting the rebel fortifications on the morning of June 17, decided to dislodge them through a frontal assault. Despite concerns about the heavy cost of such a maneuver, General William Howe led approximately 2,200 British troops across the Charles River and onto the peninsula. The fighting that followed was brutal, chaotic, and revealing. As British troops marched in precise lines up the hill, colonial defenders waited. Prescott, famously, is said to have ordered, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The command wasn't bravado, it was necessity. Gunpowder was scarce, and every shot had to count. The first 2 British assaults were repelled with staggering losses. Only on the third attempt, when the colonial ammunition had nearly run dry, did British forces succeed in breaching the redoubt and forcing a retreat. By the end of the battle, the British had taken the hill, but at a terrible cost, over 1,000 casualties, including many officers. The colonial losses were fewer, around 400, but symbolically, the engagement reshaped both sides' understanding of the war to come. The Battle of Bunker Hill was technically a British victory, yet it marked a turning point in the revolution. The ferocity of the colonial defense shocked British commanders and Parliament alike. The myth of British invincibility had been pierced, not by professional soldiers, but by hastily trained volunteers. In London, news of the costly battle prompted King George III to issue the Proclamation of Rebellion in August 1775, declaring that the colonies were in open revolt in Boston. Meanwhile, the siege continued. George Washington arrived at the colonial camps outside the city in early July. He found a scattered and poorly organized militia, brave but lacking discipline, supply chains, and formal command structure. One of Washington's earliest challenges was transforming this ragtag force into a functioning army. He imposed drills, organized ranks, established supply lines, and dealt with internal disputes over enlistment and pay. Throughout the fall and winter of 1775, the Continental Army maintained the siege, constructing fortifications and keeping British forces penned within the city. As the new year dawned, Washington sought an opportunity to strike. That opportunity came in the form of cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga, hauled nearly 300 miles across snow and ice by the young officer, Henry Knox, in what would be known as the Noble Train of Artillery. With these heavy guns in hand, Washington formulated a bold plan. On the night of March 4, 1776, under cover of darkness, Continental forces moved onto Dorchester Heights, a commanding position south of Boston. Overnight, they built fortifications and positioned the new artillery overlooking both the city and the British ships in the harbor. But when morning broke, General Howe saw the truth. The American guns could devastate his forces. An assault on the heights would be suicidal, and remaining in Boston was no longer tenable. After brief negotiations, the British agreed to withdraw. On March 17, 1776, British troops and over 1,000 Loyalists evacuated Boston by sea, sailing for Halifax, Nova Scotia. The city was free, and the first major American victory of the war had been achieved, though often overshadowed by later campaigns. The Siege of Boston, and the battles that defined it, offered critical lessons. At Bunker Hill, Americans proved their willingness to fight and their capacity to stand against a superior military force. At Dorchester Heights, they showed strategic ingenuity and boldness under Washington's leadership. These victories were not decisive in the overall war, but they carried tremendous symbolic weight. They emboldened the revolutionary cause, encouraged enlistment, and convinced many skeptical colonists that independence was not only desirable, it might be achievable. For the British, the events were sobering. Boston had been a stronghold, yet they had been forced to retreat in the face of an army that, just months prior, did not even exist. Moreover, the British began to realize that the conflict would not be confined to New England. As spring approached, they turned their eyes south, to New York, the Carolinas, and beyond. Meanwhile, American leaders, emboldened by their success, began to speak more openly about separation. The question was shifting from how to negotiate with Britain, to whether a complete break was now the only viable course. The evacuation of Boston marked a turning point in both morale and momentum. In the colonies, it was celebrated with public prayers, songs, and official proclamations. March 17th would later be commemorated as Evacuation Day in Boston, a local holiday observed for generations. For George Washington, it was a crucial early success that solidified his leadership and unified the Continental Army around his command. Politically, the retreat from Boston weakened British influence in New England and strengthened calls for independence across the colonies. In Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, revolutionary sentiments began to rise. Pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense circulated widely, arguing persuasively that reconciliation was no longer possible. The Continental Congress, once hesitant to declare a final break, began preparing for the next step, independence. But the road ahead would not be easy. With Boston now in American hands, the British shifted their focus to New York, a strategically vital port with deep Loyalist ties. The war was moving into a new phase, larger in scope and far more dangerous. The defense of Breed's Hill, the long winter siege, and the triumphant entry into Boston. These were the opening acts of a conflict that was only just beginning. The colonists had shown resolve. They had rallied around leadership, held firm under fire, and achieved an early symbolic victory. But darker storms loomed ahead. In the next chapter of our story, we turn to the sweltering streets of Philadelphia, to debates in Congress, to Thomas Jefferson's pen, and to the bold declaration that would change the course of history, the Declaration of Independence. By the summer of 1776, the winds of revolution were no longer subtle. They blew openly, sweeping across the colonies with a force both ideological and irreversible. From Boston to Charleston, the question was no longer if war had begun, but whether reconciliation with Britain was still possible, or if something bolder, final, and defining must take its place in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress gathered in the sweltering heat of early June to debate the unthinkable: independence. For over a year, the colonies had been at war. Battles had been fought, blood had been shed, yet, officially, the colonies still claimed loyalty to King George III. Their grievances were directed at Parliament, their hopes still tied, if tenuously, to reconciliation. But this fragile thread was unraveling. The Proclamation of Rebellion, issued by the Crown in 1775, and the hiring of German mercenaries to repress the colonial insurrection, signaled to many that the king had made his position clear. He would not listen. He would not yield. Meanwhile, voices across the colonies grew louder, calling not just for redress, but for liberty. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, had galvanized public opinion. Written in plain, powerful language, it argued forcefully for complete independence, not as a risky venture, but as a natural, necessary step. By the spring, several colonial assemblies, including those in Virginia, North Carolina, and Rhode Island, had passed resolutions supporting a break from Britain. And so, in June 1776, the time had come for Congress to act. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose before the Continental Congress and introduced a simple but seismic resolution: resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Debate followed immediately. While many delegates supported the spirit of the resolution, some hesitated, concerned that their colonies had not yet authorized such a bold step. To give time for discussion, Congress postponed a vote until early July, but in the meantime, a committee was formed to prepare a formal declaration. This committee of 5 included Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Sherman of Connecticut, Robert R. Livingston of New York. Of these, it was Jefferson, young, eloquent, and philosophically inclined, who was chosen to write the first draft. He withdrew to a quiet room in a boarding house on Market Street, and over the course of 2 weeks, composed a document that would echo through centuries. Jefferson drew from Enlightenment thinkers, particularly John Locke, and the colonial charters themselves. The draft would proclaim self-evident truths, outline the crimes of the British king, and declare to the world a new nation's existence. When Jefferson presented his draft to the committee, Franklin and Adams suggested only minor revisions. The document, elegant and urgent, was nearly ready. On June 28, the committee presented Jefferson's draft to Congress. For the next several days, delegates reviewed it line by line. The debates were careful, and occasionally heated. Some edits softened the language, others removed passages seen as divisive. One such section, denouncing the slave trade, was struck from the final draft, after delegates from South Carolina and Georgia objected. Jefferson, deeply disappointed, later recorded his frustration, but bowed to the political reality of the moment. On July 1, Congress resumed full debate on Lee's resolution. It passed on July 2, with 12 colonies in favor, and 1, New York, abstaining. In his diary, John Adams predicted that July 2 would be celebrated by future generations as the true birth of American independence. But it was July 4, the date when Congress officially adopted the text of the Declaration of Independence, that would be etched in history. That day, as the final version was approved, a new chapter began. The document opened with the now familiar words: when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and then followed the most famous line of all: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration listed over 24 grievances against King George III, accusing him of tyranny, obstruction of justice, military aggression, and more. But beyond specific complaints, the Declaration laid out a vision of government, not by divine right, but by the consent of the governed. Copies were quickly printed by John Dunlap, a Philadelphia printer. These became known as the Dunlap broadsides, and they were distributed across the colonies. Public readings were held in town squares, bells were rung, and crowds cheered in New York. After hearing the Declaration, a group of patriots pulled down a statue of King George and melted it into musket balls. The symbolism was clear. The ties that bound the colonies to Britain had been cut. The Declaration of Independence was more than a list of grievances. It was a manifesto of Enlightenment ideals, an argument for the legitimacy of revolution, and a statement of moral and political philosophy. Jefferson's words, though shaped by others and modified by Congress, would become the foundation of American identity. The phrase, "all men are created equal," though not fully realized at the time, would echo in future generations' struggles for liberty and justice. The Declaration also served a strategic purpose. By stating their cause publicly, the colonies sought to justify their actions to foreign powers, particularly France and Spain, whose support they would need. It framed the conflict not as a civil rebellion, but as the birth of a new nation, and it gave soldiers and civilians alike something to rally behind, a common language, a shared purpose, and a reason to endure the hardships ahead. In the weeks following July 4th, the Declaration spread across the colonies and beyond. State governments ordered public readings. Churches incorporated it into sermons. Printers reproduced it for newspapers and pamphlets. For the average colonist, farmer, artisan, merchant, the words gave form to feelings long simmering beneath the surface. But independence was a declaration, not yet a reality. British forces, under General William Howe, were preparing a massive campaign to take New York, and Washington, though victorious in Boston, would soon face his greatest challenges. The signing of the Declaration itself took place gradually. While the document was adopted on July 4th, most delegates signed the official parchment copy on August 2, 1776. John Hancock, as President of Congress, signed first, his large, bold signature becoming legendary. Though unity had been declared, divisions still lingered. Loyalists remained scattered throughout the colonies, and many questioned whether the new states could truly stand on their own. Yet the choice had been made. There was no turning back. As the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, a new identity began to form. 13 colonies, now 13 states, bound not by geography alone, but by shared ideals and a willingness to fight for them. But the path to freedom would not be easy. Ahead lay defeats, retreats, cold winters, and bitter doubts. In our next chapter, we follow the Continental Army to the streets and harbors of New York, where Washington would face the largest British invasion of the war, and where the very survival of the Revolution would hang in the balance. As the cold winds swept across the Pennsylvania hills, the fires of revolution flickered, but did not fade. It was the winter of 1777 into 1778, and the Continental Army, weary and ill-supplied, took shelter at a place that would become legendary. Valley Forge. There, amid bitter cold and gnawing hunger, amid disease and doubt, an army endured, transformed and prepared for what lay ahead, and far across the Atlantic. In glittering courts and candlelit parlors, the stirrings of alliance began to take form. The Revolution, once thought fragile and isolated, was beginning to draw the attention of Europe. Following the Battle of Saratoga, in late 1777, the war reached a critical turning point. The American victory had stunned the British, but it came at a cost. General Washington, facing renewed British aggression, was unable to stop their occupation of Philadelphia, the rebel capital. In December 1777, the Continental Army withdrew to Valley Forge, just 20 miles northwest of the city. There, Washington chose to encamp his troops for the winter. Valley Forge was not a battlefield, but its trials would be no less severe. Meanwhile, the diplomatic efforts of Benjamin Franklin in France, slow and delicate, began to bear fruit. The combination of military resilience and political diplomacy would soon change the course of the war. By the end of 1777, the war was at a crossroads. The British had captured Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to flee westward to York. Pennsylvania. Washington's army had suffered several defeats, including the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. Though morale was low, Washington chose Valley Forge for strategic reasons. Its proximity to British forces in Philadelphia and its defensible terrain. Yet what awaited the army there was not just cold weather. Shelter was scarce. Food supplies were inconsistent and poorly managed. The army lacked proper uniforms, blankets, and shoes. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in rags. Others left bloody footprints in the snow. Disease spread rapidly, including typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia. An estimated 2,000 soldiers died that winter. Despite this, Washington maintained control thanks to discipline, charisma, and resolve. Support came from unlikely sources. In February 1778, a former Prussian officer arrived, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, with no formal English and only a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. Von Steuben set about transforming the Continental Army. He introduced standardized drills, streamlined command structures, and instilled a sense of pride and professionalism. His methods, clear, repetitive, and rigorous, soon bore results. The soldiers emerged from Valley Forge not broken, but reborn, as the snows fell at Valley Forge. Washington's headquarters bustled with quiet activity. While the soldiers built huts, chopped firewood, and huddled for warmth, their leaders planned, reorganized, and waited. Von Steuben, with the help of translators, created a manual of drills that would later be adopted across the army. He emphasized formations, bayonet use, and discipline. Soldiers practiced 4 hours each day on a parade, ground carved from the icy terrain. Officers were trained to lead with precision. NCOs were held to new standards of conduct and instruction. Morale, once dangerously low, began to improve. Washington's reputation as a steady and tireless leader was further cemented. Even as food ran short and Congress failed to deliver consistent support, Washington wrote tirelessly, appealing for aid, coordinating logistics, and holding the army together by sheer determination. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Benjamin Franklin, diplomatic, charming, and cunning, continued his delicate courtship of France. Franklin understood French culture and politics. He dressed in simple colonial garb, which only enhanced his exotic appeal among Parisian elites. He lobbied tirelessly in salons and courts, building relationships with French politicians and thinkers. The victory at Saratoga provided the proof. France had been waiting for that. The American cause had a real chance of success. On February 6, 1778, France formally recognized the United States as an independent nation and signed a treaty of alliance. It was a stunning diplomatic success. The French would provide financial aid, military supplies, and, eventually, troops and naval power. Spain and the Dutch Republic would also become involved indirectly, further isolating Britain on the world stage. News of the alliance reached Valley Forge in early spring. It lifted spirits and renewed the sense of purpose among the troops. By June, the army broke camp, leaner, stronger, and more unified than ever before. They had survived not just winter, but the crucible of despair, and what emerged from Valley Forge was no longer a ragged militia, but a professional army ready to face the world. Valley Forge became a defining chapter in the American Revolution, not for a battle, but for a transformation. The suffering endured there revealed the depth of commitment among the soldiers and the capacity for renewal under the direst conditions. It demonstrated Washington's leadership under pressure, his ability to hold the army together through persuasion, endurance, and dignity. Baron von Steuben's training laid the groundwork for a disciplined and structured Continental force. The hardships also exposed flaws in Congress's logistical systems, prompting later reforms in military supply chains and command. On the diplomatic front, the French alliance was a turning point. Until then, the American cause had fought largely in isolation. Now it had the support of one of Europe's great powers. The entry of France turned the war into a global conflict, stretching British resources thinner and opening new theaters of operation. Without French support, ultimate victory may have remained out of reach. Together, Valley Forge and the Treaty of Alliance marked a moment of survival and strategic ascension. As spring returned to Pennsylvania, the Continental Army departed Valley Forge, not with haste, but with quiet confidence. In June 1778, they would meet British forces again at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. There, under a scorching sun, the new drills and discipline proved their worth. The battle was tactically indecisive, but it showcased the growth of Washington's army. Meanwhile, the war was expanding. France began preparations to send fleets and forces to the Americas. In the Caribbean, British possessions came under threat. In Europe, Britain now faced diplomatic isolation. The revolution was no longer a colonial rebellion. It had become an international war. The lessons of Valley Forge, discipline, perseverance, unity, would continue to shape the army's development, and the French alliance would soon provide the critical support that would help bring the war to a dramatic climax at Yorktown. But for now, the soldiers looked ahead, battle-tested, hardened by winter, and buoyed by the promise of global support. Valley Forge would linger in memory, a place of hardship but also of hope. The cold had tested the body but forged the spirit. And far beyond the snowy encampment, the world was beginning to choose sides. With France now an ally, and the Continental Army rising in strength, the war would enter a new phase, more complex, more global, and more decisive. In our next chapter, we journey to the southern campaigns where the war would take a different shape, marked by bitter civil conflict, shifting allegiances, and some of the most brutal fighting of the Revolution. In the gentle tidewaters of Virginia, a final act was taking shape. As the American Revolution entered its 7th year, the hopes and exhaustion of a long struggle rested on one last campaign in the quiet town of Yorktown. A British general would fortify his position and unwittingly set the stage for surrender. The siege that followed, a patient, grinding encirclement, would not be the bloodiest battle of the war, but it would be the last major one. And beneath the haze of cannon smoke and the cadence of marching feet, a new nation's fate was quietly being sealed. By mid-1781, the war in the American colonies had entered a decisive phase. Fighting had spread across regions, from the snowy north to the humid southern colonies, with neither side able to claim total victory. The British strategy, once focused on New England, had shifted to the southern theater, where they believed loyalist support would turn the tide. After seizing Charleston and winning at Camden, British forces under General Charles Cornwallis pushed into Virginia, hoping to disrupt supply lines and force a decisive blow. But American resistance stiffened. General Nathanael Greene frustrated British efforts in the Carolinas, while General Washington kept pressure near the north. By late summer, Cornwallis moved his forces to Yorktown, a small port town on the Chesapeake Bay. There, he began constructing defensive fortifications, intending to hold position until reinforcements could arrive from New York. But what Cornwallis did not know was that a bold plan was underway. Washington, along with French General Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse, was preparing a convergence by land and sea that would trap the British Army and bring the war to its final turning point. The roots of the Yorktown campaign were laid months earlier. In July 1781, Washington met with French commanders to devise a strategy that could deliver a decisive blow to British forces. While some favored an assault on British-held New York City, Washington agreed to shift focus to Virginia, where Cornwallis had recently dug in with over 7,000 troops. It was a daring move. Washington and Rochambeau's combined armies would need to march over 400 miles south, while Admiral de Grasse sailed a powerful French fleet north from the Caribbean. Timing was everything. If the French Navy could block the Chesapeake Bay and the Franco-American forces arrived quickly enough by land, they could surround Cornwallis before reinforcements from New York could arrive. By late August, the plan was set in motion. Washington and Rochambeau began their secretive march south, keeping the true destination hidden to prevent British discovery. Meanwhile, de Grasse's fleet arrived in the Chesapeake in early September and successfully defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Capes, effectively sealing off Yorktown from the sea. By late September, American and French troops had encircled the town by land. Cornwallis now found himself isolated, trapped between enemy forces on land and an impenetrable blockade at sea. The siege had begun. The Siege of Yorktown officially began on September 28, 1781. Over 17,000 American and French troops took their positions around the British defenses, forming a tightening ring. The town, once a peaceful port, became a prison for the British Army. Artillery batteries were constructed carefully and methodically. French engineers, veterans of European wars, worked with precision. On October 9th, the first cannon fired, signaling the start of bombardment. For nearly 2 weeks, the Allies shelled British positions. Day and night. The noise was unrelenting. Buildings crumbled, earthworks shattered, and morale inside the British camp began to erode. Washington oversaw the siege, personally sharing command with General Rochambeau in a rare but harmonious cooperation. French troops, well-trained and well-equipped, fought side by side with American soldiers. On October 14th, a critical assault took place. 2 key British redoubts, known as Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, had to be taken in order to tighten the noose. American troops, led by Alexander Hamilton, stormed Redoubt 10 under cover of darkness while French troops attacked Redoubt 9. Both attacks succeeded within 30 minutes. The path was now open for the final push. Inside Yorktown, Cornwallis faced grim realities. Supplies were dwindling. Troop illness was spreading. No help was coming. On October 17th, a drummer appeared atop the British parapet, followed by an officer holding a white handkerchief. Cornwallis had requested a ceasefire. Negotiations followed. Swiftly, 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, British forces marched out to the surrender field. They laid down their arms to the sound of a British military tune. Said by some to be the world turned upside down, Cornwallis, pleading illness, did not attend the ceremony. Instead, his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, attempted to surrender to the French, but General Rochambeau deferred to Washington. Washington, in turn, gestured to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, to accept the surrender. It was a symbolic gesture, echoing a British snub Lincoln had received at the fall of Charleston in 1780. The war was not technically over, but its outcome was now clear. The Siege of Yorktown was not the largest battle of the war, nor the most costly, but it was the most decisive. It demonstrated the power of coordination between armies, nations, and services. The success of Yorktown depended on careful planning, rapid execution, and perfect timing. Washington's march, Rochambeau's support, Degrasse's naval blockade, each element was crucial. It was also a testament to the maturing American forces, better trained, more experienced, and able to work alongside European allies as equals. For the British, Yorktown exposed the vulnerability of their far-flung empire. With their army trapped and their fleet defeated, Britain faced the hard truth. Military victory in America was no longer within reach. Public support in Britain began to falter. Parliament grew restless, and voices for peace began to grow louder. Yorktown shifted the war from battlefield engagements to the diplomatic table. After Yorktown, fighting continued in scattered skirmishes, but no major campaigns followed. British forces still occupied New York City, Savannah, and Charleston, but the momentum had vanished. In early 1782, the British government entered negotiations with American, French, and Spanish diplomats. The peace process would take months, but it was clear to all involved that the revolution's military phase was over. Back in Britain, Prime Minister Lord North resigned. His successor began pursuing an end to the war. In America, news of Yorktown brought jubilation. The Continental Congress praised the victory and citizens across the colonies celebrated. The war had lasted over 6 years. It had taken lives, strained families, and tested the nation's resolve. But Yorktown had made victory not just possible, but inevitable. A new chapter, that of diplomacy and state-building, would now begin. And so, in the gentle hills of coastal Virginia, amid cannon smoke and soft surrender, a revolution found its resolution. Yorktown would not be the final act, but it was the last great battle. The path to peace was now open. In the next chapter of our journey, we will explore the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the formal conclusion of the warrant, the birth of a fragile, hopeful, and newly independent nation. In the calm that followed Yorktown, the cannons fell silent. But the war, though no longer fought on the battlefield, was not yet over. What remained was diplomacy, a careful process of negotiation, where borders would be drawn, debts tallied, and a new nation formally recognized. That it would take nearly 2 years of delicate talks, spanning oceans and empires, to transform victory into peace. And when that peace was finally written, in ink rather than blood. It marked not only the end of the American Revolution, but the beginning of the United States of America. The Siege of Yorktown, in October 1781, had signaled the end of major combat operations, but the war's official conclusion required more than surrender. The American colonies still had to be recognized as independent. Loyalists needed protection. Territories had to be defined. And the complex web of alliances, particularly with France and Spain, needed to be carefully balanced. In early 1782, the British government, under increasing public and political pressure, began to shift toward peace. Prime Minister Lord North resigned in March, and a new ministry more sympathetic to negotiation was installed. Across the Atlantic, in Paris, American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, prepared to meet with British envoys, but their task would not be simple. They had to navigate not only British reluctance, but also the interests of France and Spain, whose support had helped win the war, but whose priorities often differed from those of the Americans. And so, the revolution entered its final phase, a quiet, deliberate negotiation to determine the fate of a continent. The American delegation in Paris was a formidable one. Benjamin Franklin, already revered in Europe, was well versed in diplomacy and deeply respected in French society. John Adams, sharp and principled, had long advocated for independence and a strong American position, and John Jay, a seasoned diplomat, brought a keen legal mind and a deep understanding of European politics. They faced British negotiators led by Richard Oswald, who arrived in Paris in the spring of 1782 with instructions to explore peace terms. Complicating matters was the role of France and Spain. France had entered the war in 1778 to weaken Britain, not necessarily to help the United States secure broad territorial gains. Spain, meanwhile, hoped to recover Gibraltar and other possessions. The American delegation understood these dynamics and feared that their interests might be sacrificed in favor of European goals. So, although they were instructed by Congress to consult closely with France, Adams, Jay, and Franklin chose instead to negotiate directly with Britain in secret. By bypassing the French and Spanish, the Americans hoped to secure more favorable terms, particularly regarding territorial boundaries and fishing rights. Their boldness paid off. In November 1782, the American and British negotiators reached a preliminary agreement, though final ratification would take nearly another year. The result was a treaty that not only ended the war but secured the independence and future prosperity of the new United States. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. Its terms reflected both the triumph of the American cause and the diplomatic skill of its negotiators. At its heart, the treaty recognized the United States of America as a free, sovereign, and independent nation, a statement simple in form, but monumental in meaning. Beyond recognition, the treaty contained 10 key articles, each carefully worded to address the complexities of war's end. The first article declared full independence, not just in name, but with all rights and privileges belonging to a sovereign state. The second article outlined boundaries. The United States would stretch from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west, from Canada in the north to the northern border of Florida in the south. This vast expanse more than doubled the territory previously administered by the 13 colonies. The third article granted American fishermen rights to operate in the rich waters off Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a key concern for New England. Other articles addressed the treatment of loyalists, calling for the return of confiscated property and the halting of persecution. Both sides agreed to settle debts owed to creditors and to release prisoners of war without further harm. Importantly, the treaty also provided for the evacuation of British troops from American territory, a process that would take many months and not be without tension. Though the treaty brought peace, it did not resolve every issue. Tensions over boundary lines, debts, and the treatment of loyalists would linger into the post-war years, but for the moment, the ink on the treaty signified something greater than terms. It was the formal birth certificate of a new nation. The Treaty of Paris was more than a diplomatic victory. It was a bold assertion of American statehood on the world stage. The decision by Adams, Franklin, and Jay to negotiate directly with Britain, against the advice of Congress, was a calculated risk, one that secured broader concessions than might have been possible through indirect channels. The generosity of British terms has long invited analysis. Some historians suggest that Britain, seeking to end the war quickly, granted broad territorial boundaries in hopes of driving a wedge between America and its European allies. Others note that the British saw economic opportunity by fostering peaceful trade with the now independent United States. For the Americans, the treaty not only fulfilled their struggle for independence, but secured critical economic and territorial foundations for future expansion. But peace brought new challenges as well. The Articles of Confederation, which loosely bound the states during the war, would prove insufficient for governing a vast, diverse republic. Foreign policy, commerce, and national identity would all require careful reconstruction. But these were the problems of peace, and they were welcome ones. With the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the American Revolution formally came to an end. The last British soldiers departed New York City on November 25, 1783. A moment celebrated as Evacuation Day. Across the former colonies, flags were raised, bells rang, and quiet joy settled over a people long burdened by war. In December, George Washington resigned his commission to Congress in Annapolis, returning power to civilian government, a rare and powerful gesture of Republican virtue. The United States faced enormous tasks ahead, drafting a durable constitution, rebuilding an economy, and forging a place in a world of monarchies and empires. But for now, it had peace. The Treaty of Paris closed one chapter and opened another, one filled with possibility. From colonial rebellion to sovereign republic, the journey had been long, but the nation had endured. And so, with quiet signatures in a Paris chamber and a final farewell from a beloved general, the war for independence drew to a close. What lay ahead was the great experiment of nationhood, untested, uncertain, and yet full of promise. In our next and final chapter, we turn to the aftermath of the Revolution, how the new republic navigated identity, governance, and the legacy of war. The guns were now silent, but the work of building a nation had just begun. The drums of war had faded, the treaties were signed, and the long conflict that had shaped a continent had come to an end. But for the people of the former colonies, peace brought with it new uncertainties. For the first time in modern history, a nation had been born not of monarchy or conquest, but of principle, of self-governance, of individual liberty, of the bold idea that power could rest with the people. In this quiet space after revolution, the United States would begin its next great chapter, not as a collection of colonies, but as a republic. The conclusion of the American Revolution in 1783 marked more than the end of war. It signaled the beginning of a political experiment, unlike any the world had seen. 13 former British colonies, each with its own history, government, and economy, had now declared themselves united, but were bound only loosely by the Articles of Confederation. A document drafted during wartime meant more to coordinate defense than govern a nation. The transition from rebellion to republic would be neither smooth nor swift. Economic hardship lingered. Inflation and debt plagued the new states. British forces, despite the treaty, retained outposts in the West, and political divisions began to surface. What kind of government should the United States have? How much power should rest in the hands of states versus a central authority? And could a nation this vast and varied truly function as one? These were the questions that defined the post-war era, and the answers would shape the nation's future. The years immediately following the revolution were marked by uncertainty. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had no executive branch, no power to tax, and limited authority over commerce or foreign policy. Each state retained its sovereignty, and often acted in its own interest rather than in concert with its neighbors. Trade disputes erupted. Paper currency became nearly worthless. And Western territories, vast, unorganized, and contested, stirred both hope and tension. In 1786, discontent boiled over in Shays' Rebellion. an armed uprising by Massachusetts farmers protesting high taxes and economic injustices. The rebellion was swiftly put down, but it sent a clear message. The young republic was fragile and in need of a stronger, more cohesive foundation. This unrest spurred calls for reform. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia for what would become the Constitutional Convention. Though originally intended to revise the Articles, the delegates instead drafted a new constitution, one that created a stronger federal structure, balanced powers among branches of government, and embedded principles of checks and balances. It was not without controversy. Debate over representation, slavery, and states' rights was fierce. But in September 1787, the Constitution was completed. By June 1788, it was ratified by the required 9 states, and the United States of America, as we now know it, was born again. This time, not from revolution, but from deliberation. On 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first President of the United States. With his steady hand and unifying presence, Washington became the living symbol of national stability. His presidency established many of the norms and precedents that still guide American governance today. Congress passed the Bill of Rights in 1791, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, press, and due process. Political factions began to emerge during these early years. Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, favored a strong central government and close ties with Britain. Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, advocated for agrarianism, states' rights, and sympathy toward revolutionary France. Though the war had ended, its impact rippled across the globe. In France, revolutionary ideas fanned the flames of the French Revolution in 1789. Monarchies across Europe watched warily as the American example inspired new generations to question authority and demand rights for enslaved peoples in the Americas. The rhetoric of liberty proved both empowering and bitterly ironic. While the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, millions remained in bondage. Debates over slavery intensified in the early republic, with northern states moving gradually toward abolition, while southern economies became more deeply entwined with human bondage. In the West, indigenous nations faced increasing pressure as settlers moved into newly claimed territories. Despite promises of peaceful coexistence, conflict, displacement, and broken treaties became the pattern of the new nation's expansion. Yet even in its contradictions and imperfections, the American Revolution stood as a beacon, proof that a people could overthrow empire and build something new in its place. The legacy of the American Revolution is complex and enduring. It proved that Enlightenment ideas of liberty, popular sovereignty, and natural rights could be the foundation of an actual nation. It showed that rebellion, when grounded in principle, could lead not to chaos but to order. But the revolution also revealed the limits of its own ideals. Women, enslaved people, Native Americans, and the poor were largely excluded from the freedoms it proclaimed. And yet, those very ideals, etched into founding documents and enshrined in public memory, would become tools for future generations, a promise to be fulfilled and a challenge to the conscience of the nation. Globally, the revolution inspired movements in France, Latin America, and beyond. Its success encouraged other colonies to imagine independence and pushed monarchies to consider reform or risk revolt. Domestically, it forged a uniquely American political identity, rooted in constitutionalism, civic participation, and an ongoing debate about the balance of liberty and order. By the early 19th century, the United States had begun to expand westward, absorb new territories, and build institutions of government and commerce. The Revolution remained a defining touchstone, invoked in times of crisis, reform, and conflict. From abolitionists to civil rights leaders, from suffragists to immigrants, generations of Americans would point to 1776 as both origin and aspiration. It reshaped not only North America, but the very idea of what a nation could be. A place where laws, not monarchs, held power, where citizenship, not nobility, defined one's place. and where the future, though uncertain, was shaped by the will of the people. And so, as we close the long arc of the American Revolution, we return to where we began, a scattered collection of colonies evolving through conflict, through debate, and through hope into a nation. It was not a perfect revolution, but it was a profound one that redefined freedom, challenged empire, and left behind a legacy still unfolding today. As you drift into sleep, let these echoes of history accompany you. Steady and enduring. The birth of a nation, the story of a people land, the quiet power of an idea that would change the world.